What is going on, everyone? If you are new to my channel, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. Thank you for your support. This is going to be a slightly different format video where I'm going to be doing a lot more talking because I wanted to dive deep into one specific topic. The topic for today's video is going to be muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth, because I wanted to talk about it because I feel like there's a disconnect between what's been going on in the fitness space and what people understand for muscle growth. So I wanted to give you guys a more scientific approach and break it down in the simplest forms so you can learn as much about it and you can implement it as much as you can into your own training. So hope you enjoy. I think that the most common goal in fitness, besides body fat reduction, is muscle hypertrophy. In layman terms, that just means getting bigger muscles. Many strength training programs, from the most simple ones to the most complicated and sophisticated ones, tend to prioritize muscle hypertrophy heavily. Yet, it seems like bro science is confusing the general public, like I said, resulting in misinformation and misunderstandings on what the mechanisms of muscle growth actually are. I want to preface this discussion with the caveat that it is quite easy for beginners to see more rapid improvements in strength, followed by a prolonged period of significant hypertrophy just with about any resistance training. But as a trainee accumulates training years and more experience, these gains in progress tend to slow down and sometimes they even stall. But if we follow the basic and most fundamental principles of muscle growth, we can expect to break through any plateau, really. Besides a logical training program, though, it is important to consider things like genetic determinants and outside lifestyle factors like getting adequate sleep and nutrition, because those might play an important role in muscular adaptation. As far as nutrition goes, being in a calorie surplus, that means consuming more calories than you expend, is really important for muscle building, but you don't need an excessive amount of calories. What you need to determine what your maintenance level calorie is, and then you should set the caloric goal to slightly above that, so you gain weight at a rate of about half a pound per week to minimize fat gain. But that's a topic for another day. Maybe in the near future I'll make a video about nutrition requirements for muscle building. But let's focus on the principles of muscle hypertrophy. Research is limited as far as training programs goes, since it often fails to capture the complexity and individual variation. It still tells us something we might claim with confidence. More importantly, it highlights what we still don't know. And in our dive into something like hypertrophy, we should be curious but skeptical, as we should be with any other topic. We should know what we know, and we should also acknowledge what we don't know. All right, let's talk about the first term. Mechanical tension is a product of the muscle fiber force experienced in production of work and under conditions of stretch. There are sensors in the cell membrane of individual muscle fibers that respond to mechanical tension by triggering an anabolic cascade and increased protein synthesis. Some scientists believe that mechanical tension is the basis, the most important thing for hypertrophy. Bouts of high mechanical tension exist in all hypertrophy-inducing training programs, and it's virtually impossible to do meaningful resistance training and not have mechanical tension. But also there is virtually always some measurable metabolic stress and muscle damage also at work. And this really clouds the picture. High metabolic tension is required to stimulate certain types of fibers, like white, fast, glycolytic type 2 fibers. And low mechanical tension per fiber experienced in slow eccentrics may preferentially stress a different type of fiber, the slow, red, oxidative type 1 fibers. What this suggests is that a fiber type specific development program is theoretically possible. And such a program has never been convincingly demonstrated, and it presents its own hurdles in practice, but that may be a discussion for another time. Now, the broad term of metabolic stress refers to biochemical changes in the muscle produced that are typically associated with work. There are thousands of potential metabolites that are modified by exercise. Blood flow restriction training effectively augments hypertrophic responses by creating a hypoxic or lack of oxygen environment in the muscle, and this in turn elevates metabolic stress. Some researchers maintain that the hypertrophic effects of blood flow restriction may be the result of confounding factors. Mechanical tension increases with fatigue, so BFR may simply reduce the number of reps needed to create fatigue. But if that were the only meaningful effect, then metabolic stress only would help hypertrophy because it increases mechanical tension. There's counter evidence to that point, which suggests that metabolic stress may also directly increase type 2 motor recruitment potential. Though quite contentious, in the end, this disagreement is rather academic. It's probably not relevant to the average iron warrior chasing gains at the weight buffet. There's other potential effects of metabolic stress, which include post-exercise spikes in anabolic hormone signaling, cellular swelling. Exercise damages significant portions of the muscle fiber, including the contractile elements and the membrane. What happens is that following exercise, the body needs to go through a process of repair and regeneration. This process is part of an inflammatory cascade that may produce growth signals to stimulate hypertrophy in a non-trivial way. Some speculate that muscle damage is practically unrelated to hypertrophy and simply may occur in parallel to hypertrophy. To bolster this point, muscle appears to hypertrophy significantly, at times without significant damage. It's even possible to induce so much damage that muscles will actually atrophy. Programs that produce different amounts of muscle damage seem to produce the same amount of hypertrophy as long as mechanical tension is roughly the same. The evidence is by no means conclusive. Again, it's extremely difficult to tease out an effect of muscle damage independent of all the other processes. Sometimes it's more helpful to zoom out and ask questions about specific training variables to find out what works for hypertrophy and what might not. So, what are these training variables that influence hypertrophy? We know that intensity, volume, frequency, and rest may be variables that are highly influential for muscle growth. The relationship between training intensity and hypertrophy traditionally was thought to point to an optimal rep range of 8 to 12. But more recent evidence contradicts this claim, and a meta-analysis data shows no significant differences in hypertrophy between low load and high load strength training, despite significant differences in strength improvement. This further suggests an unclear relationship between strength and hypertrophy. A pooled meta-analysis data shows a dose-dependent relationship between volume, measured by the number of sets that you do in a week for a particular muscle group, and hypertrophy. Researchers speculate that a periodized approach to training volume would be appropriate. So progressive overload, avoiding excessive accumulation of fatigue, is still the gold standard of practice. Now let's talk about training frequency. Training frequency doesn't really seem to significantly impact hypertrophy as long as volume is held constant and accumulated fatigue doesn't interfere with the effort. There are various other pros and cons for high frequency versus low frequency training that individuals should weigh on their own, depending on what their goals are. Since in the real world, weekly volume will often increase along with frequency, it's more likely that high frequency training will be more beneficial as long as fatigue isn't overwhelming. This does not mean that everyone should add more frequency immediately upon finding a plateau. Some people might see gains in hypertrophy in a low frequency and even low volume program. All right, let's talk about rest periods. Most bodybuilders are notorious for minimizing interset rest periods in an attempt to increase the intensity and the fatigue that they experience during a training session and the pump that they feel in their muscles. Now, that practice persists to this day in some circles. Current research suggests that this strategy may not be optimal, since longer rest periods are far more advantageous in increasing the potential number of near max effort sets and total volume load. This increases the dose mechanical tension stress, which we've established already as likely the most significant driver of hypertrophy. While both short and longer rest periods produce improvements, the research to this point has been limited in scope and quality. The fact that shorter rest periods, about less than 60 seconds, don't really show a clear advantage over long rest intervals as an important point. However, rest interval selection should still be dependent on a combination of the complexity and demands of the exercise and the experience and constraints of the lifter. As with all of the other previous variables, a mixed approach might be the most optimal way to go. A discussion of the literature at this point lacks the detailed perspective parameters. It can only serve as a brief introduction to hypertrophy training. Each study should be taken with some skepticism because of all the confounders, small sample sizes, short duration, limited measurements, and inter-individual differences in responses. It's not a good idea to simply take one study at face value and to start extrapolating conclusions to every single other scenario. It's okay to say that we don't have the answers, but we are working towards building a stronger body of evidence. And right now, my best advice to you is to continue experimenting intelligently, of course, on yourself and on people that you might train. Create a training program that fits your life. Balance variety and consistency. Train at different frequencies and intensities that balance progressions. And above all, ask yourself why this goal is important to you and how long are you willing to commit to it. The application remains more an art than a science, and actually, it's art informed by science. Hope you guys enjoyed and hope to see you next time.